James Day, public television pioneer and chairman of the CUNY TV Advisory Board, passed away in April 2008. His legacy includes the series Day at Night, which aired for 130 episodes beginning in 1973. The program features interviews with many of the great thinkers and achievers of the 20th century. These 30-year-old programs have been restored. The interviews remain fresh and relevant today, exploring issues that are still important to society. Showing them again is CUNY TV's tribute to Jim and his contributions to public television.
Dr. Jacob Bronowski may well be the nearest thing we have to Renaissance man. He's a mathematician, a poet, historian, playwright, and a philosopher of science, as well as an authority on the poetry of William Blake. With one foot in the world of science and another in the world of the arts, he's been an outspoken critic of the idea of two cultures. He sees science and the arts as two aspects, interrelated, indivisible, of human culture, and denies that science is mechanical and neutral and unconcerned with human values. Jay Bronowski is Polish-born, Cambridge-educated, and since 1964, a senior fellow at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in California. He's the author of 11 books, the most recent of which is The Ascent of Man, a history of science developed from his highly acclaimed 13-part television series for the BBC, shown no less than 3 times in Britain, and to be seen in this country for the first time this fall on public television. Dr. Bronowski, as a mathematician, how do you respond to those who say to you, I suppose at dinner parties, I never had a head for numbers, I'm more interested in people?
I usually ask them a question about their mathematics teacher, and invariably, I suppose as a mathematician I should say cautiously, almost invariably, it turns out that they disliked their teacher very much, and I'm sure their teacher disliked them. In short, I'm confident that in most cases they were badly taught.
Mathematics is not all that frightening then?
Well, some people are better at it than others. Yeah. I can't run the mile in 4 minutes, but there are a lot of people who can. Mm-hmm. It's not frightening, it's not forbidding. Most people can do it quite well, but most people are badly taught.
You've said that for you, mathematics is a form of poetry.
That's in distinction from prose. A great deal of science is prose in the sense that it describes the world. But a great deal of mathematics and pure science in general is poetry in that it goes into depths which are admirable for their beauty, not for their usefulness.
Mathematics as beauty and not usefulness? One thinks of mathematics only as a utilitarian kind of thing.
Well, I did 30-odd years of mathematics, and I don't suppose I proved a single useful theorem. Oh, with one exception. I only proved, let me change that. With one exception, none of the theorems that I proved could be said to be of any use, except that they were very thrilling to read by those who enjoyed that form of intellectual beauty.
As a kind of language, then, and in this case, a language of poetry.
Let me quote any poem at random. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate, begins one of the later sonnets of Shakespeare. That's a statement that has no possible application. It's moved hundreds of thousands, no doubt millions of people. It's expressed with an exactitude which has all the hallmarks of mathematics. That is, thou art more lovely and more, what comes next, what comes next? Temperate. Why temperate? Wonderful description of a woman. Well, most of mathematics is like that.
You said that mathematics to you has always been visual. I've always thought of mathematics, of course, as adding up a column of figures to over-dramatize the point. But I hadn't thought of mathematics as being visual.
I see you have been even worse taught than most of my dinner neighbors.
Indeed, I have.
The beginning of mathematics, certainly of mathematical proof, in Greece, in 6th, 5th century BC, is entirely concerned with geometrical figures and their relations to numbers. The oldest theorem that we know, and the theorem that you certainly know, the theorem of Pythagoras about the right-angled triangle, is marvelous because it is able to relate the right angle, which is a geometrical idea, to the numbers which make up the triangle. Now, it's that relation in the world which makes mathematics such a powerful tool, because most of the time we don't want to know about numbers, but about configurations. That's particularly true today. Particularly now, almost all scientific concepts are concepts of configuration. Let me give you a terribly simple instance. If you take an ordinary pencil and write with it, it writes because the pencil lead rubs off on the page, because the atoms on it are arranged in parallel layers and slide over one another. Those are carbon atoms. They are exactly the same atoms as make up a diamond. Why, by contrast, is a diamond the hardest natural substance in the world? Because in the diamond, the same carbon atoms are locked in rings and interlocked in such a way that they become immovable. That's what mathematics has to say about nature, and that's why it is geometrical, particularly in modern science.
Is this the relationship, then, that science has to the arts? Because I know that you feel that that relationship does, in fact, exist. You've just described a bit of science that comes very close to being art, if it is not art.
But if you're talking about mathematics, then it's all closely related to the arts. Indeed, in England, you can take mathematics as a university course, either as an art subject or as a science subject in most universities for that reason. Yes, indeed, as soon as you're dealing with natural configurations, the main interest of which is their interrelation, the way they lock and knead together, then you are in the field of the arts. You are looking for exactly the same thing that the arts are, except that you are looking for it in impersonal nature instead of in personal relations.
You've said that both science and art are a search for the unity in hidden likenesses. You've illustrated this with poetry. But it's clear that in science, it is not simply a recording of fact, that imagination, clearly from what you're saying, plays a very large part in science as well as in the creation of poetry or the creation of graphic arts or whatever.
The remark about unity and variety, by the way, I took from Coleridge, a poet, who took it from Pythagoras, a mathematician. Where does fact end? Where does imagination begin? Well, in a sense, fact is what the world faces us with, and it's chaotic. We are surrounded in nature by a multitude of phenomena in which, if order exists, it certainly does not display itself. It is when human beings enter into that they ask themselves, where is the trail through this chaos? And the trail is called science, if we are talking about inanimate nature. But if we are talking about animate nature, about living things and their personal relations, then the trail is called literature or drama or cinema. But in each case, what I, the scientist, you, the reader, get out of the theorem or the book is a series of landmarks which say, follow these steps and you will see that there is a hidden unity, what I've called a trail, in the variety of nature. Now, finding that requires imagination. That's not displayed for you in the open book of nature or in the hidden book of human motives.
Why does it require imagination? Wouldn't a scientific analysis, to use a cliche, wouldn't that disclose the hidden trail in, for example, inanimate objects? But you're employing a different part of the mind, the imagination, making guesses, hunches.
I wonder if I could use the analogy of personal relations, that is animate nature, before going on to inanimate nature. Most people understand their motives, and those of people close to them, pretty well. But as soon as they begin to ask themselves, what were the motives of Brutus in taking part in the murder of Julius Caesar? What were the motives of Cleopatra in both encouraging Mark Antony and betraying him? They come into an area of guesswork in which they grope. They all bring some understanding to that. But the reason why they prefer to read Julius Caesar and Shakespeare or Antony and Cleopatra is that they become aware of the fact that not only is the language more beautiful, but the analysis of motives that Shakespeare brings to it is immensely more powerful and rich. You have a realization that you're not reading some reach-me-down psychoanalyst off Madison Avenue. You're reading somebody to whom the motives of the heart are home. Such a person is a great imaginative artist. He feels himself into the situation of others. Now translate that analogy to the men who first understood what makes a pencil write and the diamond hard, who are people that I happen to know. One was Lawrence and William Bragg, the other was Desmond Bernal. One of them is still alive, the other two are dead. They were all wonderful people. But their imaginative insight into the possibilities of nature, the experiments which they then arranged to see which of their guesses was right and which was wrong, that's what made them great scientists.
You were born at a time when science was really coming into its own in the early part of this century. Einstein, I guess, had published his theory of relativity, what, in 1905, just before you were born, as a matter of fact. Were you influenced by this in your early years to take up mathematics and ultimately science? Or were you at all affected by what was happening?
I was influenced by the life of people like Einstein in two ways. Both of them interesting in different ways. First of all, you're right in saying that my family and I were influenced by the great reputation that he and other scientists had by the time of the First World War, to consider that a career in science was a very proper vocation for a poor ghetto boy to follow. In that sense, I became a scientist, or I suppose, much as Yehuda Menuhin became a violinist. His father thought that there was a good living in it, and moreover, he had immense talent. Let's never suppose that you start with being able to make a living at it. But then in my middle life, another great event in which Einstein was involved took place. You see, I was at Cambridge from 1927 to 1933, and that was a time of enormous advance in the new science of quantum physics. That was very exciting for all of us. But just towards the end of that period, Hitler came to power in Germany. And those of us like myself, who in fact had not stayed behind in Germany, I left Germany as a boy of 12, those of us who had only known at a distance that this threat was rising over Germany, we were of course absolutely prostrate. I at that time was editing an undergraduate magazine.
A literary magazine, was it not?
A literary magazine, quite right. And I felt that I and my fellow scientists had let Europe down. I felt that for Germans to be able to say that Einstein was some kind of monster, on the one hand because he was Jewish and socialist, and on the other hand because he wrote a kind of physics which was unacceptable to old-fashioned pan-Germans. I thought that was a betrayal of the human spirit, but I thought that that betrayal had been perpetrated, not by people like Hitler, who were maniacs, monomaniacs, and not even by the Germans who elected them. It had been perpetrated by us who had failed to persuade the German nation that great, human, kindly men whose intellectual power was matched by their emotional depth were in science. And Einstein was one of them. Everyone who knew Einstein knew that he was a marvelous personality. For him to be portrayed as a kind of circumcised rat was ghastly. So in 1933, for the first time, I began to write about science for popular audiences. That's over 40 years ago. And in a way, it's what brings me talking to you now, because I've never given up, though I would never even have thought of going into it had the terrible example of Hitler and Einstein not brought me up short.
I wanted to carry you a bit further back, Dr. Bronowski, to the time when you first came to England. You had been born in Russia, or Poland, what is now Poland, but was then Russia, is that right?
It was Russia when I was born.
Yes, and then to Germany, as you said, at the time of World War I. And
at the end of World War I, 1920.
And at that time, having spoken 2 languages at the age of 12, you came to, your family moved to England, fled Germany, of course, and you came to England and learned English for the first time.
That's right. We didn't flee Germany. We left Germany in 1920 because we were connected with people in England. My parents had in fact been married in my maternal grandfather's house in London in 1907. And it was natural to go to England after we had been caught in Germany for the war years. And it is true that when I arrived in the spring of 1920 in London, I could only speak 2 words of English. I could say good afternoon, which my parents had taught me on the boat coming over.
You said that it was fortunate that you took up the study of science and English at the same time.
Very fortunate, because it made science a language to me, both as strange and yet as necessary as English. In a phrase that I have used before, I learnt the word for water and the formula for H2O, almost at the same time. Now, that seemed very normal. And something else came out of that. You see, English is a wonderful language. Of all the European languages that I can stumblingly read, or even that I can speak fluently, it is the most precise, the most well-turned, the least labored, the one in which it's possible to make a simple statement with a simplicity so final that it goes straight through the brain to the heart. Well, science became the same language for me. I never thought it at all difficult to say things in science if you could say them well in English. And by contrary, when I ran a laboratory in England and young men began explaining to me what they were doing at great length, I would say, Now stop, put your pen down. Say it to me. If you can't explain it in English, then it's sure to be wrong when it's written in science.
You've said that when you came to London as a young boy of 12, you described yourself as a small Jew, ex-Russian, ex-German, and that this had its effect upon you in making you self-dependent, independent of the help of others. Has this been had an effect upon you in your work in science and literature?
I think I am rather insensitive to the opinions of other people. In personal relations, that's a handicap to me. But in the relations to what I write, what I publish, what I do in science, no, it's been a great help to me, because I'm always sure that the only person who knows whether it's right or wrong is me. And if I don't think it's very good, I'd better not publish it. And if I do think it's good, then to hell with what anybody else says.
Are you a harsh judge upon your own work?
I think I am a fairly harsh judge. That is, I publish slowly, and I still have many works lying in files with which I'm not quite satisfied. I think they're too long, and particularly I think they're too long. You see, I think nearly everything that people write is too long. All my books, as you know, with the exception of the last book, are very short. So I think that, yes, I have been a fairly harsh judge. I've been a fairly successful judge, because, you see, I cannot think of any book of mine that was a great success in the year that was published. But without exception, all my books have sold better and been far more widely read 10 years after they were published than in the year in which they were published. And something of the same kind is true in my scientific work.
They are remarkable because they are written in a language that non-scientists can easily understand. Did you set about to do this at the point where you made the decision to write and talk about science to a larger audience, as you spoke of earlier, at the point where Hitler came to power?
No, curious enough, I didn't. Curious enough, I had discovered my talent for exposition earlier. And I come back to thinking that that talent arises from the fact that I learned the language of science and the language of English together. But it was because I had discovered that talent for exposition that after Hitler came to power, I decided to put it to practical use, yes.
What interested you first in William Blake? When did that interest begin and how?
Well, that's a very curious and slightly lengthy story. Do you really want me to tell you?
Well, perhaps you can tell us a short version of it.
I had read Blake, of course, as I read other English poets when I was an undergraduate. I had not found his verse very exciting. It had seemed to me vague, somewhat mystical. So when I wrote my first book, which was called The Poet's Defense, I did not include him. My first book was very widely read and received by literary critics and discussed by them. And I was naturally flattered by this attention. Who would not be? However, I discovered at the end of being flattered with that talent for harsh self-criticism to which you have drawn my attention, that I hadn't changed anybody's mind. That those who held a thesis similar to mine before they read the book still held it, and those who held an opposite thesis still held it. Well, after a year of most laudatory reviews by all the literary eminences of England, that was a disappointing result. So I decided that my next book on poetry would be much more analytic. And I decided, therefore, to go to a poet and to a period of history about which I had no prejudices of any kind. by a chain of argument which I will spare you, I was decided on the end of the 18th century, which is the Industrial Revolution and the Romantic Revival combined, and on William Blake as its representative.
What led you to change your original opinion of William Blake?
Reading him closely, seeing him in the setting of his time, discovering that what people had said were references to the Bible and to vague mystical concepts and to fantasies by Robert Flood and other mysterious authors, were nothing of the kind. That most of the time Blake read the daily newspaper, was deeply involved in the life of his times, looked at the cartoons of Gilray, and was embroiled in the politics of the years from 1776 to, well, at any rate, to 1800 or so. Now, those politics are very powerful because the first was the American Revolution and the second was the English Revolution. That's the Industrial Revolution. And the third was the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And that's why when my book about him has been published in this country, it's been called, not as it was called in England, William Blake, A Man Without a Mask, but William Blake and the Age of Revolutions.
Do you find that what he said for his time is appropriate for our time?
It's exactly for that reason that I found him so fascinating and that people now do. Since I wrote my book 30 years ago, he has, of course, become a favorite poet, but not because I wrote about him, because everybody recognizes that he speaks from his age to ours, that like every great poet, what he says is eternal because it's timely in his time and wakes an echo in ours.
Thank you very much.